That's my mantra.
I love it.
So I think anything that gives... This is G. It's a G meeting.
All right, so should we go ahead and get started?
Yeah, whenever you're ready.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, good afternoon, and thank you for attending the session today on contracts and grants. R. Donnelley is proud to be an executive level sponsor for the Data Coalition, and we would like to thank the Data Coalition for their staff and members, as well as the open data community, for bringing together this great program today. Today's program started with momentum and enthusiasm carried from the Data Transparency Town Hall last Friday, where Amy was attending and several others. Some of the key discussion points from that meeting were also heard here today. Karen Lee, Branch Chief of OMB's Office of Financial Management and Data Analytics, stated implementation of the Data Act approach needs to be data-centric, incremental, reuse of existing process and data, collaborative, and interactive/agile to conduct small-scale projects. We heard this repeated throughout the day today, and we'll focus on that during our discussion with contracts and grants. R. Donnelley understands this approach as we have deep industry experience helping regulators and government agencies around the world move to open and transparent data while using their existing forms and data dictionaries. The solution R. Donnelley supports can leverage agencies' existing forms and process while mapping agencies' data to agency-specific structured data sets, which become the data standards that you use to analyze your current information. This is important as it's in line with the approach of the Bureau of Financial Services, where Friday, Marcel Himio stated the Data Act implementation doesn't require changes to agencies' existing programs. It's an exercise in mapping existing data to new standards. With that, I'd like to welcome our breakout session, Amy Haseltine, HHS, and Debra Sonderman with the Department of Interior to talk about their approach to managing the Data Act implementation.
Thank you. Thanks, John. And good afternoon, everybody. One of the things that I want to mention, Amy, during the question period or the brainstorming period, Amy and I will be walking around. So we're not taking any entrance fees. You know, there won't be a second collection today. So if you want to move closer to the front, anybody that, you know, we won't be offended if you need to get up and step out to take a call or do whatever. But it would probably help facilitate the conversation if you could move forward. And I
We will
promise
not bite.
we
promise.
won't. Yeah, we don't bite. And
This is being agile.
this right. So thank you for that.
We know you can do it. And collaborative.
Thanks so much. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about some of the things that we have done or working on in the acquisition community, and then two little points about where the transparency journey has taken us at the Department of the Interior. In the acquisition community, in the federal government at least, we are blessed that we actually have governance and processes in place, which makes it much easier for us to get standards adjudicated, collaborated, discussed among the agencies, and then put into place so that they have government-wide effect. That's through the chief acquisition officers, senior procurement executives. That's my role at the Department of the Interior. We have the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council, and then from the systems standpoint, the Award Committee for E-Government, which oversees the system for award management and other initiatives. That's a joint committee that represents both financial assistance and acquisition. I'm appointed to that as an acquisition member, and then we have a procurement committee for e-government that oversees the integrated acquisition environment family of systems. We, as you know, you all know, we've been on the journey toward transparency for many years. And in procurement, transparency is not just a post-award activity. a lot of people tend to think about it in terms of reporting and things that happen after the award is made. But truly, in the space of acquisition, making the contract award is only part of the process. We start much earlier with registration, having a centralized system. The system for award management has, despite some bumps when it was initially rolled out, has enabled us to take giant steps in data consistency and standardization across the federal space. Prior to the implementation of SAM, we had about 10% of our contractors who regularly used what was our prior online representations and certifications application, what we used to call ORCA. We rolled that functionality into SAM and made it a requirement for federal contractors to complete that information. Now, 100% of the entities that register in SAM as interested in contracts complete that. So that gives us insight into issues that are of grave importance when we think about responsibility, past performance, and other kinds of information that award officials need to take into consideration. Things like tax delinquencies, whether they've had prior terminations for cause or default, and other sorts of things that we wouldn't necessarily get every time, or we would have to ask on a contract-by-contract basis. So much more efficient and much more effective in the long run, I think, for us in the acquisition community by having that functionality rolled into SAM. I will comment that there's a policy gap. We've done a really good job of requiring people to register in SAM. In the case of acquisition, they have to, and in financial assistance, they have to register actually before they can submit an application for grants.gov, or likewise for contracts. But on the agency side, we don't have yet a policy in place that requires us to use SAM as the authoritative source. At the Department of the Interior, we have been on a journey for a number of years to implement, and we have all of our bureaus on a single integrated system, our financial and business management system, that integrates our accounting information, our contract award system, our grant award system, budget execution, property management. Interior is a big property management agency, into one system. And we went from having, by the number that I was aware of, 45 separate vendor databases in our legacy environment to one, with a process that you can't manually enter data into our vendor database. We authenticate with SAM, and so, if an entity isn't up to date, it's go fix your record in SAM. It's nice to know that you've changed your bank account, but you need to go update that information in SAM, and we'll get it tomorrow in our daily, we get an overnight daily update. So we have put a process in place so that we can rely on SAM as the source for our awardee information. I think this is really a critical thing as we're thinking about moving forward with standards to identify at least the awardee part of the who when we're answering questions about transparency. Obviously, we have government-wide systems for reporting. The Federal Procurement Data System, for all of its imperfections, is still a great source of a lot of information. And we've had processes in place in the acquisition world for many years where we're required to do data validation and verification to look at completeness and accuracy. At Interior, when we implemented FBMS, we were able to actually put a system control in place that an award official must complete their reporting prior to pushing the button that releases the award so that the obligation is recorded in the accounting world. So again, we have a much higher level of confidence that we are getting completeness. Quality of the data is still, it depends on how you define quality. We don't always have great descriptions, but that's a continuing journey that we'll go through. So those are just a few of the things that we are continuing to work on in the acquisition community. We've obviously got a case out for Universal Award ID and for the agency activity code, which will help us identify on the federal side the who is doing the award. And that, I'm going to turn over to Amy to talk about what we call the Fab Five.
Fab Five. Thank you, Deborah. It's good to see everybody here, and thanks for hanging in here. It is a little bit after 4, and I'm sure all of you have many things on your mind, one of which I know is data. But perhaps some others, because it is an absolutely beautiful day outside. So we are definitely going to make this interactive. I'm going to share with you a bit about something we're calling the Fab Five and tie that back into not only how the grants community works, but how those two pieces tie in with the acquisition world as well. And I am not an acquisition expert. I don't play one on TV. So I will defer any and all procurement-related questions to my colleague, who is in fact an expert. But as it relates to this notion of the Fab Five, when we think about transparency, and frankly this is true for the grants community, acquisition community, or anywhere you look across the financial life cycle, we're trying to answer 5 basic questions, and that's why we call them the Fab Five. And if you were at the Data Summit on Friday, and you were still hanging out at 4 o'clock, then you've heard this, so I apologize. But for those of you that were, you can see if I get them right from what I said on Friday. So the Fab Five. So I need everyone to put their hand in the air, and I know at least one gentleman here on the left was in the audience on Friday, so hey, nice to see you again. Thanks for coming back. All right, hands in the air. No, actually, I'm not kidding. Really, everybody put your hands up. Everyone, yeah, it's okay. Very, very well, and you can do too, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so when we talk about the Fab Five.
N-A-T-S, Nats.
And that's it, woo!
Yeah.
All right, so.
Okay, keep your hands in the air, sorry, Amy.
That's okay, it was well done. So when we talk about the Fab Five, when we talk about transparency, whether you are in acquisition, grants, loans, wherever, the public, the Data Act, USAspending.gov are answering 5 basic questions. The first question they are asking is, who gave the money out? So organization, right? The second question they are asking is, where did the money go? Place of performance. They're also asking, when did you give the money out? That's period of performance. They are asking, how much? Seems like a fairly straightforward question. How much money did you actually give? And then they're also asking for what purpose. So the Fab Five are organization amount, place of performance, period of performance, and program. Now you can all put your hands down because you did a great job. Well done. And so when you look at the Data Act or USAspending.gov, and frankly when you look at the grants life cycle or even in the acquisition life cycle, a lot of the data elements that we collect, a lot of the information that we collect is to help answer those 5 questions. So the question is not, do we have standards and systems in place to collect that data? Because the answer is yes. We have them on the acquisition side, as Debra aptly recounted. We certainly have them on the financial side, and we have them within the grants community as well. The real challenge is that if you look across the grants community and the acquisition community, and then you embed within that financial life cycle our colleagues who manage budgets, formulate the budgets and execute them, and then our colleagues who handle accounting, you are apt to find different definitions to answer those same exact 5 questions. Different words and definitions, which makes it complicated when you want to create a single standard government-wide that pulls in a bunch of information, a bunch of data, and then you want to be able to take that information and look across the financial life cycle at what happens to the dollars that are spent on behalf of the federal government and on behalf of the taxpayers. So the Fab Five are these key questions, and I think when we talk with you a little bit later and solicit your feedback, not only on whether or not and how grants and procurement data standardization writ large can be helpful, I want you to keep those Fab 5 in mind. And then secondarily, when we talk about opportunities to streamline reporting, we also want to keep the same Fab 5 in mind. When we're thinking about grants data standardization, and this relates to some of the work that HHS has done, not only in partnership with the acquisition community through the Department of Defense and through the Government Accountability and Transparency Board, but one of the things that we did find, particularly as it relates to the Fab 5, is that there's an absolute desire to collect standardized information. And there is a complete commitment to making that happen. But as we heard on Friday, if you were present in that meeting, and I think in other forums that I've been lucky enough to participate in, the desire is one thing. The key question is tactically, how do we get there? And I think that's where we talk about really the importance of what we call P4, which is this notion of people, processes and systems, partnerships, and then the importance, of course, of people. Because at the end of the day, when we talk about implementing the Data Act, we have to take a long view. We have to lean forward in how we're going to get there and what we want to accomplish. But it really requires a tactical approach that sets incremental opportunities for advancement, creates very reasonable sets of expectations going forward, and at the same time, of course, still meets the letter and intent of the law. So as you think about all of those different kinds of things, I think Debra and I would like to, with your approval, open it up for some discussion. This is an audience participation part of our program, so if you were thinking you were going to BlackBerry, you certainly can. You just have to be a little more surreptitious in doing that. But we really do want your feedback and your input. So we're going to go ahead and get started on some of the questions. There's two primary questions, and then Debra will help facilitate the first, and I'll take the second. So the two questions that we've been asked to engage on is first, the benefits from your perspectives of data standardization, not so much grants, not so much contracts, budget, or financial or others, but just in general, what are those benefits of data standardization? And again, I think there's a general sentiment across the public, across certainly the federal community, and I would suspect across the private sector as well, and nonprofit, that we need to do it. But let's get to a much more concrete reason as to why. And then secondarily, we'll focus on the question about if you were to think about opportunities for reporting, what might those opportunities be to help streamline and facilitate a lower degree of burden on those individuals who have to help us do the reporting? So Debra, I'll turn to you, and we're going to get up and walk around. Go ahead.
Yes. You've turned away from the mic.
Oh, sorry. I'll try to be more forward-facing.
They are direct-only mics.
Yes, sorry about that. So question one was benefits of data standards. Question two was brainstorming with your help, opportunities for streamlining reporting. So streamlining of reporting. And again, I want you all to lean forward, think broadly, not so much reporting just from a grants perspective or from an acquisition perspective. Go ahead.
Now, with that streamlining, I grew up as an 1102, a contracting person.
Thank you for your service.
Tremendous burden of reporting the data. And
Agreed.
I applaud transparency and the move to make more information available, but I'm concerned at the working stiff level what that means for the person having to slog through and complete all that data.
Agree. I would say even, and we'll get going on getting our notes down here on paper. And I think, Debra, do we want a volunteer to help with this?
Sure.
So is anyone who might be interested in helping volunteer? Look at that, a volunteer from the front row. Thank you.
Collaborative, that's being collaborative.
I love it, collaborative and agile. So in response to your question, though, about some of the challenges that are related to reporting, I think within the Department of Health and Human Services, what we've talked about when we talk about the potential for the Data Act is that the Data Act certainly has benefit to the recipient community. I mean, you all and many of your colleagues and your associates are parts of that. But I think from a pure federal perspective, the Data Act has benefits to the federal community. I think that in my particular professional career, there's not one day that doesn't go by that I don't have to go find a piece of information. And typically, I am not the owner of the information. I certainly am not necessarily the manager of the system that has that information, so I have to do a lot of walking around, which is a great form of exercise, but it does take time. And frankly, the questions that we're facing from the public are not stovepiped questions. People don't ask really neat questions that fit inside a single grant program. They ask questions like, what are you doing about Ebola? Well, there's many different places in HHS that help answer that question, and it requires a lot of conversation between many different people, and it would be easier, although not perfect, if we were able to have a common language to help them. So Deborah, why don't I turn to you?
Who wants to talk about what data standards might be useful for us and why there are benefits? Yes, go for it.
Wow, timing is everything.
Yeah.
Bernadette from 3 Round Stones, and I volunteer as a co-chair of the W3C Government Linked Data Working Group, and we have worked in the field of pioneering and documenting best practices and standards for publication of structured data on the web. So we often use the term lingua franca, common language for data exchange, but RDF stands for Resource Description Framework. It is the W3C World Wide Web Consortium. If anyone's not familiar with who that is, it's the member-based organization that specifies the standards for interoperability on the web. They make the web work. Very important organization. Government agencies can be members of the W3 and participate in working groups, and I really encourage consideration of that because I think there's a lack of American federal or local or state level representation within the W3. There's lots of representation from Brazil, UK, European, EU, et cetera. So that's one thing. But I think the government should have, through these CXO forums that we've heard mentioned a number of times, have people come up the learning curve on linked data, and that is the standard for structured data on the web.
Consider linked data a benefit?
Linked data,
Okay.
yeah, capital L, capital D. And that is it's not proprietary, it's not a format, it's a way of modeling your data using HTTP URIs. And it's what lots of agencies are doing who are really movers and shakers in putting data out on the web for reuse, for better discovery. It's what Google uses to find data and display it in human and machine readable format.
So could I say linked data for discovery and reuse?
Yes, for discovery, access, and reuse.
Linked data for discovery, access, and reuse. And I think part of what I heard is that we need to think beyond our own borders when we think about how information can be valuable. All right. Other thoughts? Anybody, gentlemen? Yes, sir.
Would you guys mind standing too, so all of your
Thanks.
colleagues can see how handsome and beautiful you look? That'd be great.
Thank you. My name is Benjamin Herzberg. I work at the World Bank, and I'm mostly concerned with what's happening in developing countries and emerging markets, and we learn a lot from what's happening in the US. On data standards, one of the questions I have, and I'm part of a group that's working on open contracting, and we actually have released an open contract data standards that we try to shop to various governments. But one question is, how much is it true that agencies are going to adopt any contract data standards that some federal level, entities will sign up to? Because the reality of the ground is that it's extremely fragmented. I think in the US, someone said there were about 80,000 different sources of contract. And if that's the case, then where are they all on different things? So do we need to try to have data standards so that we push agencies to do this, or should we just have all agencies release their data on the original format and let the private sector come in and create platforms to make sense of all that? So how much do we have a belief that the governments can actually do the efforts to standardize everything, or how much do we give up on that and we say the private sector can do the job of grabbing that data as long as it's open in any kind of format, and we'll rationalize it because it's going to be fragmented anyway, especially if you're talking of a federal government with state level, municipal level. We had a session earlier, and you see that there are multiple levels of data. It's a question, it's not a...
Well, I actually think it's a great question and a great comment. Debra,
Yeah, it is a great comment, because while I've had many, I joke periodically with with my colleagues in our Office of Inspector General that I issue lots of policy as the senior procurement executive that people ignore. So, or at least sometimes when you look at what people do, I think it's 80,000 contracting professionals, not 80,000 organizations. State and local governments. Okay, great. Yes.
Debra, can I also add to that? I think
Please.
that in terms of our brainstorming, what I would also take away from your remark is that, and tell me if I'm at least close to what you are getting at as well, is that it would be helpful to do two things. One is to better understand the opportunity and long-term role of the federal government vis-a-vis the private sector as it relates to the setting of standards. And then secondarily, it would be helpful to understand what constitutes the authoritative source for certain types of data standards. So I'm paraphrasing what I think I heard, but tell me if that's close, because those might be, in fact, benefits to actually having some sort of data standardization as well as a long-term governance process.
That's right, understanding what the needs are of the public sector and all the data can correspond to them.
Right.
Also, if there is any, as long as data is open, my question is, the government is inherently inefficient as a machine. And so, do we want the government to take one more task to try to harmonize all their data? It's never going to happen. So, just relevant.
It's a good question.
Okay, it is a very good question.
So the second one was
Yes.
about the government source for data.
Hi, I'm Darla Marburger with Clairview, a division of Terror Data, and I think that one of the potential great benefits of standardizing data is hopefully a more responsible usage of the data, because with the standards, people can come to know what they're looking at with regard to the data.
That's great, thank you.
Yes. You have to wait, I'm sorry. No offense.
Hi, Chris with Accenture. Just another point of something to think about. In the commercial space, a lot of commercial entities are thinking about their data as a data supply chain. So in the old world, big box retailers, dealing with supply chain issues, but now they're thinking about data as that supply chain. So they're mapping out, the sources of the data, not only making it transparent and giving people access to it, but you have to map out the use of that data all the way to its endpoint. So in the commercial space, I'm going to buy something on Amazon, they have mapped out their data supply chain to make sure that they know everything about me. But in the government space, think about the same way. Just because we make the data transparent or we come up with standards doesn't mean that I know what to do with that data. Or if I look at 10 data sets, how do I link those data sets together? So you need to think about the supply chain effect. What is the end point of where's that data going? Who's going to be using it? Whether it's for the private industry to do research or other projects, there needs to be this mapping of basically that supply chain.
So could I say improved understanding and use of the data?
Improved understanding about potential uses of the data, maybe, or mapping.
Mapping of that data. So, for instance, go back to the grant issue. I know it's been a challenge. What do you call it? The Fab Five. But it stops at who I gave that data to. So what does the university do with that data? And I know that's been a challenge to get the university to say, here's who we gave the data to, or who's producing those studies. There's political issues there that don't want to do that. But now you're starting to map out that data, that whole supply chain, right? Where did that money go? That's a whole data stream that needs to be mapped out. From the source to the grantee, all the way back. So I don't know if that's a good example, but that's what I thought of.
Because we have authoritative source for the data here,
Well, I
understanding.
think it's as the data, so tell me if this captures, as the information is moved through the life cycle.
Right.
It starts one place, and say the word name, say Amy Haseltine as a name, starts off in one place. it may end up in the context of a paper written by a university who says, dear Lord, that Amy Haseltine, she made me do X, and then that gets passed on, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, do we understand the length and depth of that supply chain as that data progresses?
And as a private industry or research organization, I now have a map.
Right.
So now I have multiple data sets, but I know the map and how these data link together. I can do an analysis of that. That's what I want to do with it.
Interesting.
Well, and I'll just observe that sometimes, until it's there, we don't know how the data can be used. And I think that's one of the things that makes all of this so exciting. You know, we certainly never dreamed back in the day when we decided to post exclusions from federal contracting online that the biggest user community of that data is not federal grant officials, not federal contracting officers. It's the banking industry who is using that information to see whether people are risky in terms of granting loans to them for mortgages or other kinds of things. So there are things that you can anticipate, but I think there are a lot of things that you cannot anticipate as well. And that also becomes very rich. You had a comment, and then you, sir.
Yeah, I think when GPS data was first collected, no one would really anticipate that someday, venture-funded startups like Waze would be, leveraging that data. But to the gentleman's point, is it from the World Bank? I think that sometimes when people talk about what's the obligation of government to publish data, we have to contemplate that billions of dollars are spent to collect incredibly valuable data on weather. These things are done with satellites, et cetera. And it's sufficient that the government publish it, but in my opinion, it's insufficient that they just publish the raw data, because what we're seeing is a lot of data converted to numbers with no context describing it. So is that 12 milliseconds, 12 kilograms, 12, what? So we need to have descriptive data, and I do think that is within the purview of the government. We're never going to anticipate all the possible uses it could be put to, but I don't think it's sufficient just to publish necessarily always the raw data. And using standards just so that there's interoperability, not far short of harmonization of data, but just interoperability so that you can combine data sets easily. The technology and the standards for that exist today, and they're mature, and we should be using them.
David, I'm from Treasury OIG, but my remark was more toward Chris from Accenture's thought about universities. And as one who is not terribly removed from that setting, I can say much of, in almost every field of social science these days, we are taught to use any of the statistical analysis packages like Stata or SAS or what have you. And I think what really hasn't been discussed as far as what the data will be used for, why it's useful to have a single language or format or whatever the term might be, is that it's for my generation. This is how we will get information about our government, and it won't be like writing a letter to our congressman or going to the library or something. These are not things that people in my generation, most unfortunately, are not interested in doing. But it will be going to whatever the central website, whether that would be usaspending.gov or successor, getting the information we want, using some basic Stata commands, and figuring out, oh, there's some seriously interesting connection between this data point and this data point. Now maybe I'll write an editorial or a blog post about it. And I feel like that really is something that has not been discussed and hasn't really been at least articulated very much. And I'd be interested to see more of that.
So could you say that a potential benefit then is the ability to compare data across sources?
I think that and access the.
Compare data across sources, and I think there was a very important nugget about how that links to social media. So who twitters, who tweets, who's on Twitter? What? Seriously? Okay, people. Who uses Facebook?
Yay.
Okay, a few more. That is where things are going. David is absolutely correct. And I don't always just say that to people from IG offices. Sir.
Hello, Rory MacDonald. I'm doing some research at George Washington University. To the gentleman's point about the World Bank, I wanted to emphasize why that's such a timely question. As I'm sure you know, the World Bank is going through a procurement reform initiative and is considering, probably will, use the country, use the donor or the country systems for procurement. So obviously the World Bank is lending money to countries, and the countries have to spend the money on schools, hospitals, whatever. And more, the World Bank is going to use the country systems for that money to be awarded. In the consultation process, there doesn't seem to be a lot of discussion about open data and standards. And I think there's an opportunity there for the standards debate to inform the thinking of the World Bank in terms of procurement. So it's a very timely thing. Getting back to this, I apologize to everybody. In the 5 things, was there anything there about performance? I mean, because I imagine that if you're thinking about best value or risk management as a government buyer of services or goods, then presumably how well something was performed is an important data point. And the final thing I just wanted to say, it's really hard to get data on task orders. So of course you have umbrella contracts like IDIQs, GSA schedules, and GWACs, government-wide acquisition contracts. Getting the data underneath there, this goes to the second question, I think. Getting that data is actually still really hard, and it shouldn't be, but it is.
Do you want to comment on the task order?
Well, first I'll comment about performance. Performance is very important, and in the world of contracting at least, we do have standard government-wide systems in place that are required to be used to report contractor performance. Understood. Like CPARS is closed to the public? Right. Correct. It is at the moment. Industry does not want us to open it, so that's a future opportunity, you know, as we get more comfortable. But it can be very uncomfortable to have that back and forth with a contractor who has not done a great job in performing or has failed entirely to perform. I think in the world of financial assistance, at least at Interior, we are struggling. Many of us are struggling with how you define performance. You look at programs like in hazardous fuels mitigation. For us, or invasive species, controlling invasive species. So we can do things to treat a certain number of acres of land. We award lots of financial assistance to do things like remove invasive species from tracts of habitat where we're trying to protect other wildlife or other plants. But we don't have enough longitudinal data to be able to say, you know, that yes, doing that treatment in 2014 enabled us to keep, the sage grouse. Or, oh my goodness, I've just been in the Rocky Mountains. Look at what the bark beetles are doing. We are going to lose all of those trees. It's pretty scary when you look at those kinds of things. So I think as we're thinking about the benefits of standardization, Amy mentioned, being flexible. We have to, and it's in the Act. The Data Act anticipates that that technology will improve over time, but to be able to use that data, if you're a researcher or a student in school and looking back to see what the longitudinal impact of programs, whether it's Head Start or whatever, any federal program, Did repairing the Washington Monument actually help preserve it for, the next 50 years or whatever? There are many questions, and being able to have the data in a form that we can retain it and analyze it over time, I think is really critical.
So the ability to retain and compare over time?
Yes.
And including performance data.
Yes.
So, and just to
Right.
make sure I capture it from the grants perspective, we do have government-wide performance reports for grants. There are two that I know of that are used by a number of agencies, although not required government-wide. One is for the research community, one is just for the regular non-research, one is for the non-research community. I would say, though, that in the analysis we did of those data elements that are embedded in those two separate forms, what we came back to, which frankly relates to the Fab 5, is that you could have a number of performance reports on, let's just say Johns Hopkins. But Johns Hopkins, as an institute, has a number of different identifiers that are related to organization. So depending upon how that is coded, and if you asked a question about Johns Hopkins and how does Johns Hopkins perform in the context of federal spending, then you would have to align the way in which Johns Hopkins is identified as a vendor, as it's compared to how it's identified as a grantee. And then within the grantee portfolio, you'd have to figure out which part of Johns Hopkins actually got the grant. And there are different structures and different ways of identifying that. And then there's not necessarily even a way that you would identify all of the different grants that Johns Hopkins has received by a single award number. So the reason we kind of focus on the Fab 5 is that in order to get to the performance side of things, you often have to ask and understand and have a standardized way of looking at very core components of what will help you define your program, your organization, the period of performance that you're examining when you're examining how a particular entity performs in the context of federal financial assistance. So you're actually asking a great question. I think my general reaction is we get it, we know we need to do it, we just have to get some other pieces better understood.
Right, and for a land-based agency like the Department of the Interior, being able to identify something in a geospatial way
Right.
is the only way that we can actually understand that on this plot of land, that we've identified with geospatial coordinates to see that kind of thing, and we're a long way off. We're just,
So why
it's a
don't we
big
do
country.
one more on this, Deborah, and then we'll kind of do a summary, and then we'll do the next
Hi,
one.
my name is Cynthia Schumann-Ottinger from the Aspen Institute, and it's funny you mentioned Johns Hopkins University.
They're a
because-
great group of people
The-
and
they're
wonderful
terrific.
grantees. They are. I wasn't picking on them.
I'm very interested in knowing type of recipient, specifically nonprofit organizations like Johns Hopkins. And there are technologies that have been developed, in fact, by a researcher at Johns Hopkins, that would enable you at the get-go to determine whether an organization is a tax-exempt organization so that they could be in the system correctly. Whether it's this side of Johns Hopkins or another, at least you would know these are all from nonprofit organizations. And it's important to get that information accurately because nonprofits have so many partnerships with government.
That's great.
Call that out, ability
Yeah, I
to
think
compare
we should-
across type, across grantee type.
Yes, and I think all recipients.
And that gets back to the organization question, which has two,
Exactly.
part of the organization is the federal government, and part is the awardee. And, how much of the family, particularly in organizations or entities that are part of a big family, it can be a challenge. Final.
Final comment, yeah, I know you wanted to move on to the next question, but take performance to the next level. We were talking about the awardee using Johns Hopkins. We're measuring them in their performance as a awardee or a grantee, but what about the performance levels of their programs? They got 50 grants.
Exactly.
How do we know that those grants and what they did with that money was impactful to U.S. citizens, to the economy, to healthcare? Are there standards or that we need to put in place with those programs to start measuring the impact to society and to citizens. Kind of going back to your analogy about, okay, we give a grant to save a particular environmental issue, how do you value that?
I think that's a great question. So I think a couple quick reactions, and then I do want to make sure we are able to, A, give our lovely Vanna White-like scribe a rest, because you did an outstanding job. But I think as it relates to the longer-term question of how you look at program within the grants committee, and I'd defer to Debra to talk through it from the acquisition perspective, but there are, from our initial analysis, a number of different ways you define program. The Government Performance Results Act defines program one way, the Budget Enforcement Act defines it a different way, the Catalog for Federal Domestic Assistance for Grants defines it a different way, and those are just three of what are many different examples. And if you look at the way the budgets are submitted to Congress, that's even yet another way. And then, of course, the Data Act gives us a definition for program too. So in terms of looking at how does an entity do vis-a-vis a program, you have to first, to the Fab Five, understand what program means in that context. I think as well, from a health and human services perspective, similar to the challenges that Interior and Debra have articulated, in some cases, there really is a longitudinal challenge in place related to collecting the data in year one, and then particularly in our research grants where we see periods of performance 7-10 years long. You have to be able to make sure that those core data elements are consistent over time so that when you're looking in year 1 and year 10, you're looking at the same entities, the same scopes of work, and being able to track that year on year. And I think those are all great questions, certainly questions from a federal perspective we would like the answers to, and our people working on that. I think there's opportunity for growth and development. I don't know if you wanted to add anything more before we shift. Okay, so can I get everybody to put their hands together and give a nice round of applause for our... All righty, so is everybody still hanging with us? Nods?
Do we need a seventh inning stretch?
Do we need a seventh inning stretch? Everybody's good? Thumbs up?
No, you're all good?
Keep rolling. All right, we're going to rock on. All right, so the second question we're going to pose, and I'll do the Phil Donahue, for those of you who are old enough to remember who he is, the reporting priority areas. So our goal here is to examine, if you think about the contracts and grants arena and other arenas, where we may have some opportunities to streamline reporting, and particularly in light of data standards, are there ways that our data standards can help facilitate more streamlined reporting? Feel free to jump in, answer questions. I'll have you stand and make sure that we get Debra. Do you want to get one more facilitator, or are you good? All right, go for it, girlfriend. All right, please.
Hi, I'm JJ with Level 1 Technologies, and we had extensive experience with FFATA and Recovery Act reporting. And we were at the Wyoming Department of Education, and building on John's theme of this is an exercise in mapping, that's exactly what we discovered was possible. So we had a mandate for the Recovery Act that any spending above $25,000 had to be included. And the Wyoming Department of Education felt that they couldn't trust their recipients to just type in that amount. And they started that way, and they found out after we started doing importing of data that of their 48 recipients, 13 of them missed at least one expenditure. So what they wanted to do instead is they wanted to pull in all data, and they didn't want their recipients to have to spend time doing it. So that was our mandate, and what we did is we built an export schema that we would give to their accounting systems, that instead of 48 districts, we were working with 3 accounting systems. The accounting systems put that in place within 6 weeks, about 40 to 80 hours of work, and it was a button click. And we have every line item dollar from the top at the federal level all the way down to lunch that somebody had on a conference. And it was easy and it's effortless. So I think the biggest opportunity building on that theme is with these new standards that we set with the Data Act, we should also have a universal exporting standard, a schema that any bank account, any accounting system can have as a button click, and that will build us, we've said all day that this is going to take time, it's going to be iterative. But if we had that early and we build our standards with that in mind, I think we have an opportunity to really make that exercise in mapping a lot easier than.
Get what you needed, Debra? Mm-hmm. Excellent. Great. Thanks for that comment. I see one in the back.
Thanks. My name is Adam Roth. I'm with a company called Streamlink Software. We have a product, Amplifund, that focuses on recipient reporting. One of the areas that we've streamlined reporting for our recipients reporting back to the federal government is going back to the concept of the supply chain of data, assuming that the ecosystem within that entity or within that supply chain is collecting data and has data accessible from the subrecipient level and all the way through. We were able to automate FFATA reporting, payment processing, and SF425 reporting through a single click, so that at the end of the day, the recipient, instead of submitting 3 separate reports, can submit one report that has reconciliation between all the different elements. And obviously that has powerful opportunities for the federal government as well. But the key, again, is if you don't have data at that level, if you don't have the full supply chain managed, you lose the ability to have the automation and the time savings. And so the key is to be able to drill down through that supply chain. We refer to it as an ecosystem, but be able to drill down through that so that you can get data rolling all the way back up, and then you can break that apart or put it together in a variety of different reporting formats. And then the data format itself is less relevant to the earlier comment from level 1. It's more about mapping and tracking, and it's less about formatting.
So if I could ask a follow-up. So it's as much about having a policy in place that allows you to get access to the information below that tier 1 level as it is about the technology? Would that be an accurate?
I would say, so I think a policy is important, but I think a system is more important. It doesn't have to necessarily be a technology system. Obviously, that's what I sell, so it should be. But from a standpoint of you need a system in place to be able to collect that data and make sure that it's getting entered in as data and not as a consolidated roll-up of information or paper, because then you can't pull it apart, and then you can't automate those 3 different reports that I just suggested. You couldn't automate that process if the information you had wasn't data. And so you need a system in order to get that through that supply chain. So it's not, right. It's not about, we're not talking about databases. Supply chain implies information movement. So it's data moving through back and forth and up and down through that process or through that ecosystem that drives the capability from a financial standpoint and also from a performance standpoint to be able to track that process.
Thank you. Great. There, and then I'll come back to the World Bank. Go ahead.
More of a question, as a government contractor, Accenture, we supply services and labor to the government, but we have to have an approved government accounting system in order for it to be, and also auditable. So it's more of a question, does the grant community have the same requirements or standards in place for their accounting systems to be somewhat approved by the government in order to publish the right data back to the government? So it could be an export mechanism or a series of standards that have to be put in place in order to streamline their reporting. I guess, I don't know if that's in place today. So we have an approved government accounting system as a supplier of services. Do the universities and the grantees have requirements or on their accounting system in order to accept a grant and then provide the right information back? Are there standards in place for that today?
So yes, sort of yes. So the question was, since the federal government, and I'll paraphrase just to make sure everybody can hear, but since the federal government has standards relative to its financial systems, do we require grantees writ large to have some sorts of financial internal controls and mechanisms in place to ensure financial stewardship of the funds? Is that close enough? Right. So the uniform grant, so yes is the short answer to your question. The uniform grants guidance that just came out does describe responsibilities that grantees need to have in place and internal controls that they need to have in place in order to take funds from the federal government. I'll be candid with you, those are high level. They, I believe, I'd have to go back and check because I think they reference other types of government-wide standards, just to be honest with you. Within the Department of Health and Human Services, when we think about and consider making an award to a grantee as a general practice prior to issuing an award, we check to ensure that the entity is fiscally sound and is able to take in the funding in a way that will ensure the appropriate internal controls are in place. The challenge, though, is that not all grantees have the same systems, and certainly not all grantees have the same level of financial stewardship that others do. And part of that is due to the nature of the grant mechanism itself. So when we give out grants to anyone, we don't necessarily ask first who the entity is, because there's some entities that by their very nature need the grant money in order to become better and more solvent and more efficient and successful. So we don't necessarily discriminate purposefully on who the entity is. It's really more, can we ensure that when we do provide the federal dollars, we provide the appropriate degree of assistance and engagement to ensure that the grantee can do what they need to do. And so it's a bit of a different dynamic simply because we don't always get to choose who we give the cash and prizes to. But we try to embed the appropriate internal controls as much as possible, because it's our money and we're ultimately responsible and accountable for that. So did that answer your question? Yeah. I saw right here.
Thank you. I think it links to what you just said on who do you give the money to. And it's a second point of your fabulous five, you know. Where did it go? For me, you can't do streamlined reporting if you don't understand the corporate world, who you're dealing with. And that means having some kind of a way to be able to understand who are those corporate entities you're touching and who is the beneficial owner of those corporate entities. So there is work today being done to try to create a single legal entity identifier across the world, because we're talking about multinational entities as well. But when you're doing something with JP Morgan, for instance, JP Morgan is not one company. It's 1,000 corporate entities. Microsoft, it's 1,000 or 10,000 corporate entities. And this is the same thing for small companies. And companies get created. They last 1 or 2 days for a transaction for this company to acquire something else, and these companies get closed. And so you got multiple amount of corporate entities. But one of the issue and one of the prerequisites that should be to streamline reporting is that the data about corporate entities should be open in the US, and it's not. You have a lot of states that do not open up their data on corporate entities. You have a lot of business registries where you don't have access to the raw data as to this public information which is there, but Delaware, for instance, keep the data private and you have to pay to access the data and make queries. But there is something you guys can look at. It's called the Open Company Data Index, which looks at all the 50 states in the US and looks at how open the corporate registries are. So I think one of the prerequisites to streamline reporting is states opening up the corporate registry information.
That's great. Thank you. Debra, did you get that?
Yes.
Did you want to make any comments about anything so far, just to make sure we don't leave you out? You're good? All right. Right up front. I couldn't hear that. Okay, great. We'll do maybe a couple more. Right.
Yeah, I'm also with Level 1. My name is Tom Whaley. I think that just to amplify on a few of the comments that have been made about standardizing accounting data, I think that as we watch the iterations of the Data Act move to a higher level of reporting, being less granular, we were all concerned that the outcome was going to be less impactful in terms of the value of those data tags. The larger the number, the less precise that number becomes, and the less manageable it becomes in the scheme of things. There's really only one way to resolve the granular issue, and that was the thing that drove everybody crazy for years, is that no one was willing to, at the lower levels, provide the amount of effort that was necessary to record the transactions and so forth. And there was a big fight among the agencies and the states and the municipalities about not participating at that level, and they won out. But the easy solution is really to mandate through accounting packages, and this would probably take legislation to do that, that at the point where the data tags are set and we know what we're looking for out of the data, to mandate every accounting system that is sold to government that they need this export built into it. Then the interfaces to follow that are really simple. Collect it and report it upstream, if not report it directly through the accounting package. Otherwise, you're going to get high levels of data that are going to be less and less useful, and we're going to not accomplish a great deal.
So I'm sorry, can I ask a follow-up? So that's at the, you said at the federal level?
We think there's going to have to be legislation. That the legislation would mandate for the makers of accounting software that sell that software to government entities, whether they be at the local, state, or federal level,
Okay.
that those accounting packages 2 years from now contain an export mechanism. The export mechanism is the driving force behind flipping the switch that allows these things to happen, and it can happen very, very easily, and now you have very precise data that is far more valuable.
Right. And the lovely woman in the gray suit had her hand up. Do you, ma'am? You? Yes.
Hello, Kirsten Schroeder with IBM. One of the agencies or the departments I've worked with the U.S. Department of Education. And one thing I've noticed is that particularly when it comes to grants, then the grantees will get dollars, but then there's sub-grantees. And those sub-grantees aren't necessarily obligated to report back to the department. And so the interesting thing is when you start to look at performance monitoring, management, and you really want to look at the impact of programs, it would be important to get data back from the sub-grantees. In this discussion, I've heard a lot about, well, you need to standardize, you need to be able to pull the data back to the federal government. I would ask maybe in this kind of conversation to think about other techniques, right, that allow sub-grantees potentially to post data or to post it in some way that doesn't necessarily mean you have to report it back to the federal government, because I don't know legislatively if that can happen. So,
It's a great question. I think, and Debra, you may want to weigh in from an acquisition standpoint, but certainly from the grants world, we have a relationship with the prime recipient. And unless the law or the underlying regulations that support that program allow us to go through the prime and reach down into that grantee, it's very difficult sometimes to get sub-award related data, particularly when you think about assessing program risk. We often have, particularly in the larger block grant programs, great prime grantees. It's when they then take those dollars and sub-recipient, provide them to the subs that it makes it much more challenging from a program integrity standpoint.
and what I've gotten is sometimes the Department of, and I'm just using them as an example, right, we'll get questions about performance at the sub-grantee level, and those are questions that are difficult to answer. And so I keep thinking a little bit, are there other techniques for being able to see performance at a sub-grantee level that doesn't require necessarily data coming back to the federal government? And I think there are, but something to kind of think about.
Great question. Debra, anything you wanted to add to that? So I think we probably have to do the wrap, because we have 5 minutes left. Thank you. Is there, sorry, I want to keep my back to you, and I don't want to trip either. So any final comments or questions before we do a quick wrap? Gentleman over here, and then we'll.
Sorry, it might be really ultra specific, but in Fed BizOps, which is the website on which procurement opportunities are posted, and you see the award, it might also be helpful to see contract modifications. As change orders, as they might be called internationally, as contracts. As you go through the life cycle of a contract and you're delivering services or goods, very often the contract changes, and you as the contractor would have it, and the government obviously has that, but those modifications aren't as easily available as they might be.
So I'm going to go ahead and give this back to you.
You want to go through a quick summary? Or?
Sure. And then I'll do it. Okay. Unless you're going to
I'll sit over there.
Okay.
I can flip this stuff.
Oh, thank you so much, John. Yep. So thank you all for the feedback. This is quite stimulating and interesting to hear about the opportunities that we have to think a little more broadly than just the meaning of transparency within the United States government, but to look across international standards and how we might benefit by adopting some of those, or at least taking those into consideration as we're going through the process to create data standards. There are, I think, the points about the practicality. You know, as we're doing this assessment in the communities that we work in and with Treasury and the Office of Management and Budget, the point from the gentleman at the World Bank about whether we can actually enforce people, you know, require people to provide information and you know, say things like, well, we're not going to pay you until you give the money that, or give us this data back. That generally is not very effective. And so I think that is something that we'll need to take into consideration. Thinking through the whole process of how data might be able to be used. A number of really valid comments and points, so thank you all for that.
And I think from my perspective, I really like this concept of the supply chain of data. It is fascinating from two perspectives. One is that it pulls in words, terminology that folks in the private sector use for reasons other than talking about information. And then I think it's also a really interesting way to change the framework we have or the concept we have about what information is. Information is a commodity. Information is power. Information is really what is required to make choices and decisions. And the lack of information often can mean the lack of a decision, or actually it can mean an actual decision gets made because there's a lack of information. So I really thought that was an excellent takeaway, and one that I know I'll share with my colleagues back at HHS. The only other two things I would add is that it certainly sounds like, just from the commentary through the room, that there are a number of technical opportunities that are currently available, and the question is just how to figure that out and how to find those partnerships and leverage that technology to help us move forward. And then in addition to those technical opportunities, there clearly are some policy challenges, and Debra alluded to this earlier, that we'll need to take into account. So thank you very much for all of that feedback. John, anything you'd like to?
No, thank you. I think we're at time, a very collaborative audience, and we thank you, Amy and Debra, for your awesome presentation. Thank you.